My name is Silas Blackwood, and I tend the graves at St. Bartholomew's Church. The locals just call it the Old Church on Sorrow Hill, though most pretend it doesn't exist at all. I've been working here for 3 years now, ever since Pastor Whitmore found me sleeping rough behind the general store and offered me steady work. The pay isn't much, but it comes with a small cottage behind the cemetery and 3 meals a day. The pastor is kind enough, though he speaks in whispers and keeps his eyes on the ground when we talk. He gave me the job with only one requirement: follow the rules that start at midnight. What rules? I asked him that first day. Pastor Whitmore handed me a piece of yellowed paper with 5 lines written in careful script. Read these every evening before sunset. Memorize them. Your life depends on it. The rules were simple enough. 1. Never look directly at the church windows after midnight. 2. If you hear singing from inside, cover your ears and count to 33. Do not enter the church between midnight and 6 in the morning. 4. If someone calls your name from within the church walls, do not answer. 5. Always carry a lit lantern during night hours. If the flame dies, leave the grounds immediately. I thought the old man was just superstitious at first. Small towns breed odd beliefs, and graveyards make people nervous. But the pastor's hand shook when he gave me those rules, and I noticed he locked the church doors with 3 different keys every evening at sunset. My first week passed quietly. I learned the layout of the cemetery, memorized which families were buried where, and got used to the rhythm of maintaining the grounds. During the day, St. Bartholomew's seemed like any other old church. The building was made of gray stone, probably built sometime in the 1800s, with tall windows and a bell tower that hadn't rung in decades. Ivy crawled up the walls, and the wooden doors were weathered but solid. The graveyard held about 200 souls, their headstones arranged in neat rows that I kept free of weeds and debris. Some markers were so old the names had worn away completely. Others were newer, though none dated past 1987. I asked Pastor Whitmore about that during my second week. People stopped wanting to be buried here, he said, his voice barely audible. They choose the new cemetery across town instead. Why? He just shook his head and walked away. The first time I experienced the rules in action was on a Tuesday night in October. I was doing a final walk through the cemetery around 11:30. My lantern casting steady light on the gravel paths between graves. The autumn air was crisp, and I could see my breath in small puffs as I worked. At exactly midnight, I heard the first voice. Silas. It came from inside the church, clear as day through the thick wooden doors. A woman's voice, sweet and familiar, though I couldn't place it. Silas, come inside. I need to speak with you. My hand tightened on the lantern handle. Rule number 4 echoed in my mind. I kept walking, focusing on checking each headstone for damage or debris. The voice called again, more insistent this time. Silas Blackwood, I know you can hear me. Please, I need your help. I wanted to respond. Every instinct told me someone was in trouble, that I should investigate. But Pastor Whitmore's shaking hands and terrified expression when he'd given me those rules held me back. I covered my ears with my free hand and continued my patrol. By the time I reached the far corner of the cemetery, the calling had stopped. I spent the rest of the night in my cottage, doors locked, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. The next morning, Pastor Whitmore asked if I'd had any trouble during my rounds. Someone called my name from inside the church, I told him. A woman's voice. His face went pale. You didn't answer, did you? No, I followed the rules. Relief flooded his features. Good, very good. What did the voice sound like? I described it as best I could. Young, pleasant, with a slight accent I couldn't identify. Pastor Whitmore nodded gravely. That would be Margaret Henley. She died in 1962, complications from childbirth. She's buried in Section 3, under the oak tree. She's trying to communicate? "She's trying to get you to open the doors," he corrected. "After midnight, you must never open those doors, no matter who asks, no matter how convincing they sound." The weeks that followed brought more tests of the rules. Sometimes I heard singing, beautiful hymns that seemed to come from a full choir inside the church. The music was so lovely that I found myself taking steps toward the building before remembering rule number 2. I would clamp my hands over my ears and count slowly to 30 until the voices faded. Other nights, I caught glimpses of movement in the church windows in my peripheral vision. Figures that looked like people standing inside, gesturing for me to come closer. I learned to keep my eyes fixed on the ground when walking past the building after midnight, trusting my lantern to light the path ahead. The hardest rule to follow was the third one. Sometimes my work kept me out past midnight, and the most direct route to my cottage led right past the church's front entrance. The doors would stand slightly open on those nights, revealing only darkness beyond. Warm air would flow out, carrying the scent of beeswax candles and old wood polish. It smelled like home, like safety, like everything I'd been searching for since my parents died. But I always took the long way around, circling behind the cemetery to reach my cottage from the back. Pastor Whitmore had been clear. The church was off limits between midnight and dawn, no exceptions. One night in November, I learned why the 5th rule mattered most. I was trimming overgrown grass around the Pemberton family plot when a sudden gust of wind extinguished my lantern. The flame vanished instantly, leaving me in complete darkness. For a moment, I stood frozen, remembering the pastor's words about leaving immediately if the light died. But I was almost finished with my work, and the cottage was only 50 yards away. Surely I could make it that short distance without incident. I started walking carefully toward home, using my hands to feel along the familiar headstones. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were soft at first, barely audible on the grass. But as I moved through the cemetery, they grew louder and more distinct. Someone was following me, matching my pace exactly. When I stopped, the footsteps stopped. When I hurried forward, they hurried too. "Hello?" I called out, though I immediately regretted breaking the silence. The footsteps stopped, but I could hear breathing nearby, slow, deliberate breaths that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. I fumbled in my pocket for matches, my hands trembling as I tried to relight the lantern. The first match broke. The second wouldn't strike. On the third try, a small flame flared to life. In the brief moment before I could light the lantern wick, I saw them. People stood among the graves, dozens of them, all facing my direction. They wore clothing from different time periods: Victorian dresses, 1940s suits, modern casual wear. Their faces were kind, almost welcoming, but their eyes reflected the matchlight like mirrors. The match burned my fingers and I dropped it, plunging everything back into darkness. I ran the rest of the way to my cottage, not caring about dignity or caution. Behind me, I could hear footsteps from all directions, growing faster as I fled. I slammed the cottage door and locked it, then spent the next hour relighting every lamp and candle I owned. Through the windows, I could see figures moving between the headstones, but they never came closer than the cemetery's edge. When dawn finally broke, they were gone. The next morning, Pastor Whitmore found me sitting on my front step, exhausted and shaken. "Your lantern went out," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, I saw people in the cemetery, lots of them." He sat down beside me with a heavy sigh. The congregation of St. Bartholomew's never really left Silas. They still attend services every night at midnight. They gather in the church and in the graveyard, just like they did when they were alive. But they're dead. Death is just another state of being here. The boundary between life and death has always been thin at St. Bartholomew's. That's why we have the rules, to keep the two worlds separate. I stared at him. "Are you saying the church is haunted?" "I'm saying the church serves both the living and the dead," My job is to minister to all souls, regardless of their current condition. Your job is to maintain the grounds and follow the rules that keep you safe. What happens if I break the rules? Pastor Whitmore was quiet for a long moment. The previous Gravekeeper lasted 2 years. He started ignoring small things, answering when his name was called, looking directly at the windows, going inside after midnight to retrieve tools he'd forgotten. One morning, I found his lantern on the church steps, still burning. He was gone. Gone where? He joined the midnight congregation. Sometimes I still see him during services, sitting in the back pew with the others. He looks content enough. The pastor's words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the November air. Would I die? No, Pastor Whitmore said quietly. You'd become part of St. Bartholomew's permanently, neither fully alive nor fully dead, but something in between. The rules exist to prevent that transformation. I spent the rest of that day thinking about his words. The job paid well, and I had nowhere else to go, but knowing the true nature of St. Bartholomew's changed everything. I wasn't just maintaining a cemetery. I was living on the border between two worlds, keeping careful balance between the needs of the dead and my own survival. That evening, I read the rules again before sunset, committing each word to memory once more. As darkness fell over Sorrow Hill, I lit my lantern and prepared for another night among the graves of St. Bartholomew's Church. The congregation would be gathering soon for their midnight service, and I had work to finish before they arrived. Winter came early that year, blanketing St. Bartholomew's in thick snow that muffled sound and made my nightly rounds more treacherous. The cold didn't seem to bother the midnight congregation, though. If anything, their activities intensified as the days grew shorter. I had settled into a routine of careful avoidance. Each evening, I would complete my cemetery maintenance before sunset, then retreat to my cottage to wait out the dangerous hours. But on Christmas Eve, everything changed. Pastor Whitmore knocked on my door just after dinner, his face more troubled than usual. "Silas, I need to ask something difficult of you tonight." I invited him in, noting how he kept glancing toward the church windows as darkness fell. "There's a problem with the furnace in the church basement," he continued. "It's been acting up for weeks, and now it's gone out completely. The pipes will freeze if I don't get it restarted soon. Can't you fix it tomorrow morning?" He shook his head. "The temperature is dropping fast. By morning, the damage will be done. The repair costs would bankrupt us." I stared at him. "You want me to go into the church after midnight?" "I know it breaks the third rule, but I can't do it myself. I'm too old to manage those basement stairs safely, especially in the dark, and I can't ask anyone from town. They wouldn't set foot on these grounds after sunset." The thought of entering St. Bartholomew's during the midnight service terrified me, but Pastor Whitmore had been kind to me when no one else would. He'd given me purpose and a home when I had nothing. "What about the congregation? Won't they be in there?" "They gather in the main sanctuary for services. The basement should be empty. You just need to relight the pilot light. It takes 5 minutes at most." I considered the request. Rule 3 was absolute, but perhaps there was a way to minimize the risk. "What time do their services usually end?" "Around 3 in the morning. If you wait until then, you might avoid the worst of it." We spent the next hour going over the church's layout. Pastor Whitmore drew me a map showing the basement entrance, the furnace location, and the quickest route in and out. He also gave me his set of keys and a backup lantern in case something happened to mine. "Remember," he said as he prepared to leave, "get in, restart the furnace, and get out. Don't explore, don't investigate anything you hear, and whatever you do, don't go upstairs to the main sanctuary." At 2:30 in the morning, I stood outside my cottage, both lanterns burning bright, watching the church for signs of activity. I could hear faint singing from inside, the familiar hymns that marked their weekly services. but the basement entrance was on the building's far side, away from the main doors and windows. I made my way carefully through the snow-covered cemetery, keeping to the path farthest from the church. The basement door was small and partially hidden by overgrown ivy. Pastor Whitmore's key turned easily in the lock, and I slipped inside as quietly as possible. The basement was cramped and cluttered with old furniture, boxes of church records, and maintenance supplies. My lantern light danced across dusty surfaces as I navigated toward the furnace room. Above me, I could hear the congregation singing, their voices creating a low vibration that seemed to travel through the building's bones. The furnace was an old gas unit that had probably been installed in the 1960s. Following Pastor Whitmore's instructions, I located the pilot light assembly and began the relighting process. The tiny flame caught on my second attempt, and the furnace rumbled back to life with a satisfying whoosh of warm air. I was gathering my tools to leave when the singing stopped. The sudden silence was more startling than any loud noise. I froze in place, listening to the furnace's steady hum and my own rapid breathing. Footsteps began moving across the floor above, not the organized movement of people leaving a service, but something more deliberate and purposeful. They were coming downstairs. I extinguished my backup lantern and dimmed the main one to its lowest setting, hoping to avoid detection. The basement had several storage rooms branching off the main area. I slipped into the nearest one, crouching behind a stack of old pews as footsteps descended the wooden stairs. Through a crack in the door, I watched as figures began filing into the basement. They moved with the same deliberate grace I'd seen in the cemetery, their clothing spanning decades of fashion. A woman in a 1920s dress led the group, followed by a man in overalls that looked like they belonged to the Great Depression era. More people continued down the stairs. Families, children, elderly couples, all with that same calm, purposeful expression. They arranged themselves in a circle around the furnace as if it were an altar. The woman in the 1920s dress stepped forward and began to speak, though her words were in a language I didn't recognize. It sounded old, formal, like Latin, but with different rhythms. The others joined in, their voices blending into a chant that made the air itself seem heavier. I realized I was witnessing some kind of ceremony that had nothing to do with traditional church services. This was something else entirely, something the rules were meant to protect me from understanding. The chanting grew louder, and I noticed the temperature in the basement beginning to rise. The furnace was working harder than it should, its flames visible through the access panel burning much brighter than normal. But the congregation didn't seem concerned about the equipment malfunction they were causing. One of the children, a boy who couldn't have been more than 10 when he died, turned toward my hiding place. His eyes met mine through the crack in the door, and he smiled. It was a genuinely friendly expression, like he was greeting an old friend. He whispered something to the woman in the 1920s dress. She looked in my direction and nodded, then continued her chanting. But now I knew they were aware of my presence. They were allowing me to witness their ceremony. The realization should have been terrifying, but instead, I felt an odd sense of acceptance. These people weren't malevolent or threatening. They were simply continuing their spiritual practices in death, just as they had in life. The basement ceremony was part of their tradition, something that happened every Christmas Eve regardless of whether the living world acknowledged it. The chanting reached a crescendo, and the furnace flames suddenly returned to normal. The temperature stabilized, and the woman smiled at the group as if they'd accomplished something important. One by one, they began filing back upstairs, moving with the same quiet dignity they'd shown throughout the ceremony. The boy who had spotted me lingered at the bottom of the stairs. He looked directly at my hiding place and mouthed the words, "Thank you," before following the others upstairs. I waited several minutes after the last footstep faded before emerging from the storage room. The basement felt different now, warmer, more welcoming, as if the ceremony had blessed the space somehow. I gathered my tools and made my way back to the entrance, my mind racing with questions. Pastor Whitmore was waiting for me when I reached my cottage, sitting on the front step despite the cold. "How did it go?" he asked. I told him about the ceremony, describing everything I'd witnessed in the basement. He listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, as if the details confirmed something he already suspected. "They've been performing that ritual every Christmas Eve for as long as I've been pastor here," he said finally. "It's their way of blessing the church for another year, ensuring it continues to serve both worlds properly." The boys saw me. They all knew I was there. Of course they did. The rules protect you from becoming one of them permanently, but they don't make you invisible. The congregation understands you're just doing your job. Then why are the rules so strict? Pastor Whitmore stood and brushed snow from his coat. Because there's a difference between witnessing their activities and participating in them. If you'd stepped out of that storage room, if you'd joined their ceremony willingly, you would have crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. What kind of line? The one between serving the church and belonging to it forever. Over the following months, my relationship with the Midnight congregation evolved. I still followed the rules strictly, but I began to understand them as boundaries rather than prohibitions. The dead residents of St. Bartholomew's weren't trying to harm me. They were simply living their eternal existence according to patterns established long before my arrival. Sometimes I would find small gifts left on my cottage doorstep in the mornings. A bundle of flowers that never wilted, despite being picked in winter. A hand-carved wooden cross that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Once I discovered a complete set of gardening tools that were far better quality than anything I could afford, arranged neatly beside my workshed. Pastor Whitmore explained that these were tokens of appreciation for my respectful maintenance of their final resting places. The congregation valued my work, even if they couldn't express their gratitude directly during the dangerous hours. Spring brought new challenges. The warmer weather meant I could work later into the evening, which sometimes put me dangerously close to midnight. I learned to pay careful attention to time, always ensuring I was safely in my cottage before the rules took effect. One evening in April, as I was finishing some repair work on a damaged headstone, I lost track of time completely. The church bell tower began to chime midnight just as I was packing up my tools. I was still 50 yards from my cottage, with no choice but to navigate the cemetery during the most dangerous period. I lit my lantern and began walking as quickly as possible toward home. Around me, I could sense the congregation beginning to gather, though I kept my eyes fixed on the path ahead. Voices called my name from various directions, some familiar by now, others completely new. "Silas, come join us tonight. We have so much to show you. You've been so kind to us. Let us return the favor." The temptation was stronger than ever before. After months of following the rules, part of me genuinely wanted to know what would happen if I accepted their invitation. These people had shown me nothing but gratitude and respect. Perhaps Pastor Whitmore was being overly cautious about the dangers. But I remembered the previous Gravekeeper, sitting contentedly in the back pew during services, no longer fully alive or fully dead. I kept walking. Halfway to my cottage, a figure stepped directly into my path. It was Margaret Henley, the woman whose voice I'd heard calling from inside the church on my first night. She wore a blue dress that might have been fashionable in the early 1960s, and her face was kind but determined. "Silas," she said, "I need to speak with you." This was different from the usual distant callings. She was standing right in front of me, blocking my way home. I stopped walking but didn't respond, remembering Rule 4. "I know you can't answer," she continued, "but please listen. There's something you need to understand about St. Bartholomew's." She gestured toward the church building, where warm light now glowed from every window. This place has served as a bridge between worlds for over a century. The living and the dead coexist here because the church was built on a natural crossing point. Pastor Whitmore maintains the balance by ensuring both communities are served properly. I wanted to ask questions, to understand more about this crossing point and what it meant, but the rules held firm. I could only listen. "You've been respectful and careful," Margaret said. "But respect alone isn't enough anymore. The balance is shifting. There are those among us who believe the time for separation is ending." She stepped aside, allowing me to pass. "Consider carefully what kind of future you want for St. Bartholomew's, Silas. Some choices can't be undone." I hurried the rest of the way to my cottage, my mind churning with her words. Once safely inside, I spent the rest of the night watching the church through my windows, seeing figures moving between the building and the cemetery in patterns I was only beginning to understand. The next morning, I found Pastor Whitmore in his study, looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen him. "Margaret spoke to you last night," he said before I could say anything. "How did you know?" "She came to see me afterward. She's concerned about the future of our arrangement here." I sat down across from his desk. "What did she mean about the balance shifting?" Pastor Whitmore sighed deeply. "I'm 78 years old, Silas. I won't be able to serve as pastor much longer. When I retire or pass away, the church board will likely close St. Bartholomew's permanently. They've been looking for an excuse for years. What happens to the congregation then? That's what Margaret and the others are worried about. If the church is abandoned or demolished, they'll lose their anchor to this world. They'll be forced to move on, and many of them aren't ready for that transition." I thought about the gifts left on my doorstep, the respectful way the congregation had allowed me to witness their Christmas Eve ceremony, the obvious care they had for St. Bartholomew's and its continued operation. Is there another option? Pastor Whitmore looked at me carefully. "There is, but it would require a significant commitment from someone willing to serve both communities permanently." "What kind of commitment?" "The kind that Margaret was hinting at last night. Someone would need to formally accept the role of caretaker for both the living and the dead. Not just a gravekeeper or a pastor, but something in between." I understood what he was suggesting. Like the previous gravekeeper, still alive, but part of their world too. Similar, but by choice rather than accident. A deliberate decision to serve as a permanent bridge between the two communities. The idea was both terrifying and appealing. I'd grown to respect the midnight congregation, and St. Bartholomew's had become more of a home than anywhere I'd ever lived. But accepting such a role would mean giving up any possibility of a normal life outside these grounds. "I need time to think about it," I said. Pastor Whitmore nodded. "Of course. But don't take too long. Margaret says there are others in the congregation who prefer more direct solutions to their problems." The next few weeks passed in a strange tension. I continued my duties during the day, but I could feel something building each night. The congregation's behavior was changing in subtle ways. Instead of calling my name from inside the church, they began leaving written messages on headstones where I would find them during my morning rounds. "Please consider our proposal," read one, written in elegant script on Margaret Henley's grave marker. "Time grows short," said another, found on the tombstone of Edwin Cartwright, dated 1934. "We need an answer," appeared on the Pemberton family monument. Each morning, the messages would be gone by the time I returned from breakfast, as if they had never existed. But the pressure was building, and I could sense the congregation's growing impatience during their midnight gatherings. Pastor Whitmore seemed to age years in those few weeks. He moved more slowly, spoke even more quietly, and I often found him staring at the church with worried expressions. "They're planning something," he told me one afternoon as we worked together in his garden. "I can feel it during my morning prayers. The church itself feels different, more charged." "What kind of planning?" "I'm not sure. But last night I heard voices from the basement again. Not the Christmas ceremony, something else. They were discussing alternatives to waiting for your decision." That evening, I decided to test the boundaries of the rules more carefully. Instead of retreating to my cottage at sunset, I continued working in the cemetery until well past 10 o'clock. I wanted to observe the congregation's gathering process, to understand better what I was being asked to join. As midnight approached, I positioned myself behind the large Anderson family mausoleum, where I could watch the church without being easily seen. My lantern burned steady and bright, keeping me anchored to the world of the living. The transformation began gradually. First, wisps of mist rose from various graves, coalescing into human shapes. Then figures began emerging from the church itself, as if the building was slowly releasing souls it had held during the daylight hours. Within minutes, the cemetery was filled with people from every era of St. Bartholomew's history. But tonight was different. Instead of proceeding directly into the church for their service, the congregation gathered in the cemetery itself. They formed a large circle around the graveyard, with Margaret Henley standing at the center near the old oak tree. "Brothers and sisters," her voice carried clearly across the grounds, though she wasn't shouting. "We have been patient. We have followed the old agreements, respected the boundaries between our worlds, but change is coming whether we act or not." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathered crowd. I counted at least 100 figures, far more than the cemetery's official burial records suggested. "Pastor Whitmore grows frail," Margaret continued. "The church board speaks of closure and demolition. If we wait much longer, we may lose our anchor to this world permanently." An elderly man stepped forward. I recognized him from the Christmas Eve ceremony. "What of the Gravekeeper? Has he not proven himself worthy?" "Silas Blackwood has shown us great respect," Margaret replied. "But respect alone cannot preserve our sanctuary. We need commitment, a willing bridge between worlds who can ensure St. Bartholomew's continues to serve both communities." A woman in 1940s clothing raised her hand. "And if he refuses?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Then we may need to consider more direct approaches to protecting our home." "What does that mean?" called out another voice. "It means," said a new speaker, a man in a Civil War-era uniform who stepped into the circle, "that we stop asking for permission and start taking action. The living world has ignored us for decades. Perhaps it's time they remembered that the dead have their own forms of influence." I felt my grip tighten on the lantern handle. This was what Pastor Whitmore had warned me about, the faction that preferred direct solutions. Margaret shook her head firmly. "Colonel Morrison, we've discussed this. Forcing our will upon the living world goes against everything St. Bartholomew's represents. We are a sanctuary, not a conquest." "A sanctuary that will cease to exist if we do nothing," the colonel replied. "I've seen what happens when the living forget the dead, Margaret. I've watched other churches fall to abandonment and neglect. The souls bound to those places don't simply move on. They fade, piece by piece, until nothing remains." The crowd began murmuring more intensely, clearly divided between Margaret's patient approach and the colonel's more aggressive stance. I realized I was witnessing a debate that would determine not just my future, but the nature of St. Bartholomew's itself. "There is another way," said a small voice from the edge of the circle. A young girl, no more than 8 years old, stepped forward. "The Gravekeeper watches us now, from behind the Anderson tomb. Why don't we simply ask him directly?" Every figure in the cemetery turned toward my hiding place. Even with the mausoleum between us, I felt the weight of their collective attention. My lantern flame flickered, though there was no wind. Margaret smiled sadly in my direction. "Because the rules forbid such direct communication, little Sarah. We cannot ask the living to join us. They must choose of their own free will." "But he's already chosen to watch tonight," Sarah pointed out with the simple logic of childhood. "That's different from following the rules." She was right. By staying in the cemetery past midnight, by positioning myself to observe their gathering, I had already stepped outside the normal boundaries. I was no longer merely following the rules. I was actively investigating the world they represented. Colonel Morrison seized on this point. The child speaks truth. The Gravekeeper has shown interest in our affairs beyond mere duty. Perhaps it's time for a more direct conversation. The congregation fell silent, all eyes still fixed on my location. I could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge. If I retreated now, if I fled to my cottage and resumed following the rules strictly, things might return to their previous state. But the tension would only continue building until something forced a resolution. Or I could step out from behind the mausoleum and face whatever consequences came from direct contact with the midnight congregation. I thought about Pastor Whitmore's warnings, about the previous Gravekeeper who had joined their ranks permanently. But I also thought about the gifts left on my doorstep, the respectful way they had included me in their Christmas ceremony, the genuine care they showed for St. Bartholomew's continued existence. These weren't malevolent spirits trying to trap an unwary soul. They were a community facing extinction, looking for someone willing to help preserve something precious and unique. I made my decision. Setting my lantern carefully on the ground beside the mausoleum, I stepped into the open cemetery. The congregation watched with a mixture of hope and apprehension as I walked toward their circle. Margaret met me halfway, her expression both grateful and concerned. "Silas, you don't have to do this. You can still return to your cottage, continue following the rules." "What would happen to St. Bartholomew's if I did that?" She glanced back at Colonel Morrison and his supporters. "I honestly don't know. We've never faced this situation before. And if I accept your offer, if I agree to become this bridge between worlds, you would gain the ability to communicate freely with us, to help guide the church's future in ways that serve both communities. But you would also be bound to these grounds permanently. You could never leave St. Bartholomew's again." I looked around the circle of faces, young and old, from different centuries, but united in their love for this place. Would I still be alive? Yes, but changed. You would exist in both worlds simultaneously, aging much more slowly, able to see and interact with both the living and the dead. Colonel Morrison stepped forward. "The choice is yours, young man, but choose quickly. Dawn approaches, and we cannot maintain this gathering much longer." I thought about my life before St. Bartholomew's, the loneliness, the constant search for somewhere to belong, the feeling that I was always on the outside looking in. Here, I had found purpose and community, even if that community was unconventional. "I accept," I said. The moment the words left my mouth, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The world looked exactly the same, but I could sense layers of reality I had never perceived before. The congregation was no longer a collection of spirits glimpsed in darkness. They were neighbors, friends, fellow caretakers of something precious. Margaret smiled with genuine warmth. "Welcome to the true St. Bartholomew's, Silas. Now the real work begins." That night, I walked through the cemetery one more time before dawn, but everything had changed. The congregation walked with me openly, sharing stories of their lives and deaths, explaining the history and traditions I was now part of preserving. As the first rays of sunlight began to touch the eastern horizon, I understood that I had found something I had been searching for my entire life. Not just a home, but a purpose that would outlast any single lifetime. I was no longer just a gravekeeper. I was the bridge between worlds, the guardian of a sanctuary that served both the living and the dead. And for the first time since my parents died, I was exactly where I belonged. I set down my lantern and walked toward the church doors, which stood open and welcoming. The congregation was waiting inside, filling every pew, their faces turned toward me with expressions of hope and gratitude. Margaret stood at the front of the sanctuary, no longer bound by the rules that had kept us separate. She smiled as I approached. "Welcome home, Silas," she said. And for the first time since my parents died, I truly was home.